Come on in.
So we're sitting here on the porch of the Bradford House, and as you said, Nancy, this would be a place where the family would entertain or they would have outdoor activities. Right now it's very pleasant. We're in the shade. There's a nice breeze that blows through, so I can understand the appeal of this place as an extension of their living space.
Absolutely. And I believe the porch actually went further around before the house was partially destroyed by fire and rebuilt. So it was actually a bit bigger than it is now. When the family lived here, which they did from about 1902 until probably into the 50s, although the father, Albert Sumner Bradford, died in the 30s, and the elder son, Alfred Hartwell Bradford, inherited the house. He worked in Los Angeles, so he came back and forth and was here mainly on the weekends, and there was a caretaker who stayed in the home. And then at some point in the 60s, the family decided there was no one living in it, and they emptied it and eventually gave it to the city.
Okay.
And at that time, the city wasn't sure what they wanted to do with it, and it sat empty for many years with dying orange trees around it. I lived down the street at the time, and my kids didn't come to the house. They used to play in the orange groves.
Right.
The dead, dying orange trees. In fact, one neighbor, I think, built a treehouse in one of them. Anyway, during that time it was empty. There were 2 fires, not started by anything in the home, probably by kids playing around. Not my kids. No. Anyway, the house was pretty badly destroyed, if not by the fire, by the water damage. And the city was thinking of tearing the house down. They didn't want to expend the funds needed to fix it up. They actually had it on the ballot, and the city voters turned down the bond or the request to repair the house to spend the money. And that's when in 1973 the Placentia Founders Society was formed. So there are modifications that were made to the home at that time. You'll also see modifications where the home office was enlarged to include a mudroom.
Okay.
There's an area off the kitchen that was probably part of the original extended porch that we now have blocked off because we use it. There's a modern bathroom down there, and there's a stove and a refrigerator and items that we need when we entertain or have guests into the home. So there's been architectural changes over the years, but we are very pleased to have it as a symbol of the history of Placentia, and as I said, the history of the beginnings of Orange County. When you tour the house, you learn a lot about the Bradford family, but you also learn about how cities are formed, what's necessary to get people to move here, what do large groups of citizens need if they're going to make it a home, how do city governments begin.
Right.
And then also the Bradford family, those things, and also what was life like at the turn of the century for a citrus farmer rancher in California, which is an important part of the history of the state, the citrus industry.
So just touching on a few of those things, obviously you've got all these citrus planters, not only the Bradfords, but others in the area. And that's why it's called Orange County, because of all the orange groves.
Correct.
But in order to get those to market, what's the most important thing that they needed at that time?
Well, there were 2 things, as I see it, and as we usually explain on the tour, particularly to the kids who come through. Adults might get this easier, the children who've never thought about it. Water, number 1.
Okay.
There was not a lot of natural water. And they did, along with Mr. Bradford, form a water company, and they brought water from the Santa Ana River by gravity. and into where a park is now, Tri-City Park. That's where they stored the water. There's actually a lake there now, an artificial lake, but that is where they stored the water and then distributed it to the individual ranchers. And then the railroad.
Okay.
Because there aren't enough citizens in this part of the country to buy all the oranges that everybody's growing. So you need to ship them to the Midwest, particularly to the East Coast. And that requires refrigeration and refrigerated rail cars.
Okay.
At the start of the ranching in this area, they used to have to take their product by cart to Fullerton to catch the train and back again. It was a day's journey. And eventually Bradford was instrumental in getting the railroad to stop, and there was a stop right here in downtown Placentia at the end of Bradford Avenue, where there were actually 7 packing houses. 2 of them belonged to the Bradfords, but there were 5 others, and there's still partial of one still there. It's been remodeled, torn down. We have a picture of it. It's now small office buildings, but part of one of the remaining packing houses is still there off Crowther Avenue. It's not the one that belonged to the Bradfords. Their 2 were more directly at the end of Bradford Avenue and were torn down a long time ago.
Okay.
So I would say water and refrigeration and railroad, and then workers who would pick the fruit. You had to have people willing to pick the fruit.
Now, of course, with the citrus groves and whatnot, it's a seasonal product.
Correct.
So you're going to have folks that are here tending to things year-round, but that's not the bulk of the workers you need.
Right.
You need a whole bunch of people when it comes time for the picking and the packing part.
Absolutely.
So where are most of those workers coming from?
Well, there were a lot of Spanish settlers here in California long before the Anglos all came from the East Coast.
Right.
And a lot of them had settled in places like Yorba Ranch, where Yorba Linda is now. There were several rancheros, and there were settlements. In fact, the home that the Bradfords originally placed on their property was actually taken apart and reassembled on the property from the Yorba Ranch.
Okay.
So there were workers in the area. Some of them were itinerant.
Right.
But there were a lot who lived in the area. And they also had some other crops. They grew walnuts, they grew a lot of cabbages, probably more for local consumption, but they did have other products they grew over the years as a called citrus rancher.
Okay. So that way then, you know, maybe other times of the year, those agricultural products have their harvest at a different time than the orange groves do, in which case then people can stay busy pretty much year-round with stuff.
Right.
Okay.
I was thinking one. Also, Bradford got into the business of citrus roots early on, where he would grow them and then sell them and export them to other people. And that's actually before his trees began to grow fruit, because it takes many years as you plant a sapling and it grows. He was supplying citrus stock to many of the ranchers, so that was another business he was in.
So with the oranges that he's growing here, are they principally Valencia oranges? Are they navel oranges? Because I know with navel oranges, you can't just, there's no seed.
Right.
So you actually have to graft
onto a tree.
Onto an existing tree.
Actually, I'm not sure of that,
okay.
But in one of your interviews, Kathy Frazee will talk all about the citrus industry.
Fantastic.
So.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
And you guys should look forward to that too.
Yeah. You may or may not want to include that. Okay.
So, well, good. Anything else that you wanted to chat about while we're here?
Well, I think it's interesting that Bradford was so forward-thinking. He left school like at 15, if not younger. He wasn't healthy, he had asthma. In fact, the reason he eventually left this property was he was bothered by the smudging they had to do in the winter and to keep the trees warm enough to produce. And so he actually moved to the La Cañada area of Los Angeles to get away from that and his asthma. So I think he missed a lot of school for that, and it was a different era. And oh my goodness, the jobs he held, as I mentioned, in his early years. And then to get on a train, and shortly after, the golden spike was struck that allowed people to come by train across the country. As a young man with a wife and 3 children at home, and to come this way was quite brave. And then to do all the things he did with the home building and electricity and the gas and bringing water and starting the first bank, quite a man to be admired. And a year after he came, the man he worked for loaned him the money to bring his wife and 3 children by train also, and his wife's sister, who was a spinster. So there were actually the 3 children, the spinster aunt, the wife. There were 6 of them living in a home at first.
Okay.
The small little house that they brought from the Yorba Ranch.
Wow.
And they did that for about 4 or 5 years, if not a bit longer, before they built this house.
Very good.
All right.